In this lesson, I want to talk about how to draw feet. So feet are similar to hands in their structure, but they're actually a lot simpler to draw than hands, and it's mostly because we don't have as much movement in our feet than we do our hands, and most often these days people are wearing shoes. So it's not really very often that you're actually drawing feet unless you're doing, nude figure drawing, but it is a good thing to know because occasionally you will need to draw feet. So I have my bone structure out here, and it's the same basic bone structure as your hands. You got the phalanges, we got the metacarpals, and the carpals. But one thing you'll notice here is that I colored them differently. The phalanges, your toes here, the ones that are pink, and because essentially that's the only thing you can really move. You can move around your toes, but you don't really have much control for how you move the inner structure of your feet. So it's an important thing to think about. Your foot doesn't really change very much unless you're standing on your tippy toes, but most of it just comes from your toes itself. So moving on, when it comes to actually drawing the feet, it's a simpler form. I mean, essentially, it is a rectangle. Come on. It's a rectangle with toes, right? That's the basic foot. But we're not square, just like our hands. We're not SpongeBob. So this is actually more at an angle. So I'm going to kind of angle this out here. Same thing with our toes. I'll get this a little bit more accurate. Our feet are actually more angled than our hands are. So that is one difference here. So you can picture this angle coming out here. Our feet actually flare out a little bit from the toes, and then they come back and get narrower in the back of our foot here. And so imagine the ball of our foot back here. So we started with that square, but you can see how, it just takes a little bit of tweaking to get a more accurate foot-like structure. Okay? And then from here, this is probably angled a little bit too much. From here, we got our toes basically on the edge, and we don't need to be as detailed with our toes. You can do cylinders like we did our fingers, but honestly there isn't really much movement in your toes that much, so it's not as necessary to break it down into different pieces. There just isn't as much going on. But I'm going to draw this as if we're looking at this from the bottom of our foot. And it's important to think about the bottom of the foot versus the top. So, we got the big toe here, and this is going to kind of narrow here. And then the littler toes, I actually probably have to narrow this down a little bit more. You basically kind of see little balls here, and then you'll see a little bit of the connecting toe. One thing to note is there usually is a gap between the big toe and the second one, and then the other four are basically touching. And this is important to note that this is when we're talking about basically cultures that have grown up wearing shoes. Most people wear shoes these days, and it is actually a natural product of wearing shoes that it bunches all our toes up together, so we grow up that way. If you were to draw a culture that lives basically barefoot, if you were to look at their toes, they would actually be more, flayed outwards like our fingers were, because that is the more natural way, but we've kind of changed evolution a bit with our use of footwear. It is important to notice if we're looking at the bottom of our foot, our toes actually look shorter if you're looking at it from the bottom versus the top. If you're looking at the top of our foot, it looks like our toes continue on longer, and you can see the knuckles a little bit more. So they look longer, whereas the bottom of the foot usually have this, the flesh on the bottom of your foot kind of covering it up. So it is an important thing to know that your toes will look a little bit longer from the top than from the bottom. They'll seem a little bit stubbier on the bottom. One thing to notice, the big toe only has 2 joints, whereas all your little toes have 3. And so what is actually happening structurally, just like our hand, we have our knuckles are inside our feet, just like our hands are. So that means since most of our big toe, that big bone, is inside the foot, and then we just have that little piece out here. So our big toe doesn't have as much movement. It's because most of it is actually inside the foot. And it's an important thing to note about it. When it comes to the inside of the foot, really, we do have more of a curve on the inside of our foot versus the outside. You know, we're not exactly perfectly even on both sides. And if you're to actually look at our footprint, really what is happening, most of our foot doesn't hit the ground because of our weight. Most of the weight is on the top and the bottom, and then, you know, a little bit in this area here. So, you know, just thinking about the weight of your foot will make a difference. And there are different arches. Some people have higher arches and lower arches, and essentially that means this area here. If you have a low arch, your footprint will be wider. You know, you'll see more of this area. Whereas if you have a high arch, you know, you'll see even less of it here. And that's one of the differences you can tend to know between men and women's feet, because women's feet aren't just smaller versions of men's feet. There is a difference, partially because, you know, the foot is smaller, so, you know, because there's different heights and weights going on, so that's one thing. But the big toe is not as prominent. You know, men will have like big square toes, where women's will be not as prominent as that. Also, the inside line is usually a little bit more curved. A little bit more curved than that, so women will have more curved feet, which women usually tend to be more curved than men. The arch line tends to be higher, so usually, you know, the arch is a little bit higher here, so this will usually be a little bit narrower. The outside length is also shorter, so like this side here is shorter, and that has to do with, you know, maybe the toes are coming down a little bit lower here. So, you know, the woman's foot is just a little bit slightly different shape versus men's, where a men's foot will kind of be longer and like stretch out more this way. Versus a woman's that is shorter. So little minute differences that don't make a huge deal overall, but it's an interesting thing to know. And last thing, just talking about our foot here from the bottom, is that you do need to know that your weight of your foot is more on the, you know, outside. It's not really in the center of your foot. It's on this outside part where we're actually seeing most of your weight. So you want to think about that when you have a character standing, is where is the weight of their foot. Okay, so let's get to the side of our feet and how do you actually draw a foot, because it's rare you're actually going to be drawing a foot from this angle. Most often you're going to be drawing someone standing, and the easiest way I like to go about drawing a feet is, you know, breaking it down into shapes like we've done so far with everything else. So usually I start with circle for the ankle, circle for the heel, and then basically a wedge for the foot itself, and then you have the toes on the end here. So if you were to see that from an angle, essentially it would look like, here's our toes, this wedge that comes backwards, and then we have a ball for the, oh, that got messed up. I'm trying to draw my wedge backwards. So here's the wedge, here's a ball, and here's the ankle. So thinking about that wedge, and the important thing I'm trying to show here is that it's actually wider in the front than it is in the heel. And what I'm actually going to do, we're going to get rid of this here, and I'm going to draw this from the front view. So essentially, it's a wedge that's wider in the front, and it gets narrower as it goes backwards. Come on. So if we were to actually look at like the inside of this wedge, see it's getting narrower, and it goes back to the heel where it's the narrowest part there. So this is where the heel is. In here, you know, you'd have the ball, or right behind it, you have the ball, that's the heel, and then a ball, that's the ankle. And then on the front, you have the toes. So I'm just going to put that in like this for now. I'm just drawing it as basic shapes first, and then I'm going to go back in and refine them a little bit more. So if we were to look at this from the back, essentially what you'd have is the narrow part of the wedge, and then it goes back like this and comes upwards. So it's narrow in the back, wider in the front, you have a ball here for the heel, and then a ball up here for the ankle. So thinking about them in these kind of basic forms will help you as you're drawing them. So let's give these guys some details here. Making them a little bit transparent so we can go ahead and draw on top. Okay, so when it comes to actually drawing them in, you know, it's important to note that we'll have the heel back here. You're going to see that ball, and then you're going to see some sort of arch, and it actually depends if you're seeing the outside of the foot or the inside, and that's going to make a difference for all these angles if we're seeing the outside and the inside, because the inside of the foot has, you know, this big curve, and there's a big gap here that's usually not touching the ground. So if we're looking at the outside of the foot, this side here, it usually looks a little bit flatter. There'll probably still be a little bit of a bump, and then, you know, you get that there. But if we're looking at the inside of the foot, it usually looks more like this, where you have much more that, you can see that arch there, and then you actually would see some of the back of the foot inside it, depending on what angle you're looking at. But it is important to know that will make a difference how much arch you do. So I'm going to make this just the outside of the foot for now. The ankle will come downwards. It is important to know that the top of the foot usually has a little bit of a bump. It depends on the person. It depends what kind of instep they have. That does make a difference. But there usually is a little bit of a bump. And it isn't just a straight angle here and this comes out. There's actually a little connecting piece that kind of slopes here to connect them there. Important thing to note. When it comes to drawing the toes, I'm going to make this so we're kind of looking at this at an angle. So we're not looking exactly from the side. The big toe comes out straight, but then all the little toes, they actually curve in. So the big toe is really the only one that comes out straight. All the others curve downward. So important thing to note here, and it's going to make it stick out a little bit more. It just doesn't curve in like the other ones do. When it comes to drawing the front of our foot, you want to make sure you get that a little bit of an arch, and then come down. Essentially, the toes just look like a line of peas here, and there is, just like our on this view here, there is that gap. You'll probably see that little bit of a gap there, and then the other toes will kind of line up. And you won't really see much here. You might see a little bit of the line. But the important thing to note here when we're looking at the front of the foot is where the ankle is. Oops. Because the ankle is actually higher on one side than the other. So the inside of the foot actually has the higher bump than the outside of the foot. So it makes a difference. You really got to think about that. And the same thing when you're drawing this here, if this is the outside of the foot based on where I put the pinky, the ankle is going to be a little bit lower than it is on the outside of the foot. And that's an important thing to keep in mind. And then when it comes to drawing the back of the foot, really the important thing to think about is that tendon. So we're not going to see much detail here, maybe a little bit toe there. But really it's this tendon where the ball of the foot essentially connects to the leg. You see that muscle, that tendon coming up here, and that's the piece that can actually get damaged. As you know, when playing sports, you hear about the Achilles heel. It's usually this one that's connecting the ball of the foot to the rest of the foot. It's the rest of the leg that can get damaged, can get pulled. So you really want to make sure you get that kind of tendon in there because it's an important thing. Okay, so that's really it when it comes to drawing feet. So really the important thing is to think about that wedge, kind of like a wedge you would put under the door. So it's angled downwards, and it also gets wider. So let's do it like this. There we go. And it gets narrower as it goes upwards. So something like that will help you, think about that wedge, taller and narrower in the back, wider and shorter in the front, and then you put a ball at the end for the heel, and then another ball for what's essentially the ankle. And that's basically what it comes down to. Most often you're drawing shoes, but it is important you can use the same structure for when drawing shoes as well, because usually shoes follow the basic structure of our feet. And that is it for feet.